So we are going to go through the update from yesterday. We've got several vendors who released. We're going to talk about some recent news, some things that have been going on there, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the continuous release examples there. I think we had another really aggressive kind of continuous release from many of the browsers in the past month. And I wanted to kind of outline what that looks like from a timeline perspective. So a lot of times you lose sight of all of the updates that come out between these Patch Tuesday events. So we do focus a lot on that here as well, just making sure you're aware of that. So after our bulletins and releases, we're also going to talk about that between the Patch Tuesdays, where Todd's going to go through an overview of the additional updates that came out, other vulnerabilities that were resolved, so on. So with that, getting into this month, we had the lineup from Adobe. Now, Adobe had a pretty massive release, actually. One of their releases resolved 225 CVEs. That was the Experience Manager, which is not really directly part of the Creative Suite that commonly gets updated by patch management vendors. It's one of the additional production studio kind of solutions they have. But that one had, I think it was 5 different researchers that were submitting vulnerabilities contributing to that. And one of them, I think, contributed over 100 CVEs themselves that they had discovered and reported to Adobe. So some pretty massive third-party researcher activity on that one that led to a very large release there. But Todd's going to walk us through the 3 updates that do relate to Creative Cloud Suite products that we support patching for. Google Chrome released another update yesterday, and we're going to talk about a couple of their other recent updates as well, because they had some recent 0 days that you'll want to be aware of. And again, because of the cumulative nature, you're going to be able to get Chrome up to date, but I'll be talking about that in a little bit here as well, the kind of continuous stream of updates and how to adapt to handle that more fluidly. Microsoft had 5 updates yesterday, and Todd's going to walk us through those here in a little bit. There is 1 0-day vulnerability in the Microsoft lineup this month and 1 public disclosure. We're going to talk about those. And then Mozilla had a security update there, but we'll also talk about some earlier Mozilla updates, especially some that related from the recent Pwn2Own Berlin event. For those of you not familiar with Pwn2Own, it's one of those hacker bug bounty kind of competitions where you can go and compete. You're basically, it's pretty intense from what it looks like. They're literally in front of cameras and media and people sitting there watching them try to exploit vulnerabilities on a timer. If you do so, you score Pwn2Own points or Pwn points, and you also get bounties for it. In the 3-day event in Berlin, they gave out $1 million US in bounties over the course of those 3 days. So a pretty significant event, a lot of very lucrative wins for several of the teams in there, and a lot of vulnerabilities discovered across a very wide set of vendors, including a couple that were discovered in Mozilla that Mozilla turned around and resolved within the next 24 to 48 hours. So a couple of things like that constantly feed into security updates that we're going to talk about today. We're going to hit a couple of news articles first. With this, I'm actually going to stop the presentation sharing and jump over to my browser here for the next few slides. So news articles, the first 2 links are basically relating to kind of recaps of what came out from a Microsoft perspective and how that's impacting from a global news perspective. The 0-day vulnerability is an RCE vulnerability in WebDAV. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in depth here in a moment. But this is a part of a threat actor campaign, so a nation state level APT called Stealth Falcon. They typically target Middle Eastern countries and have been very active, and this is one of the most recent vulnerabilities they've been using. So this talks about the WebDAV protocol that was being exploited, a little bit about how they're doing this, basically using a deceptive URL to basically convince a user to click on something, and then from there, a little bit about how they're executing their attack. So it's a good read just to understand the vulnerability itself and how it's being used in the wild. And for those of you who may be exposed from a targeting perspective, this gives you an idea of where this threat actor is operating. most of you on here today may not be in an area where this is being targeted, but anybody who has entities over in Middle East and Africa, especially in the government and defense sectors in Egypt, Qatar, Turkey, and Yemen, that's where they are. The attacks right now have been focused, and where Stealth Falcon typically operates. So one interesting conversation I had a couple weeks ago was, when do you make the decision to shift from regular maintenance mode into zero-day response mode? Trying to understand how a vulnerability like this is being used in the wild helps you to make those decisions. In this case, the vulnerability here is being used by a threat actor who has a fairly targeted kind of region that they operate in and targets that they typically go after. If you don't fall within that target, it doesn't mean you're 100% safe. It does, though, reduce the risk that you could be targeted sooner. So making the decision to go into zero-day mode versus sticking with your normal maintenance, this kind of starts to give you that context. You may have the need to take systems offline for a second maintenance window if you want to go into zero-day mode. If you decide to do that, you can have that kind of risk analysis of, okay, if we've got our business critical application, it's a server group of 10 servers that we would have to take down to patch that update if we needed to. For that, it costs us $5 million to take it offline for an extra maintenance window. That compared to the risk of this, if I'm not in the vertical they're targeting, if I'm not in the regional that this is being targeted in, the risk of this impacting my environment drops down steadily. So I may choose to not change my tactic there. So this kind of information, that's why we try to identify more about this as we talk about, especially the 0 days. That helps give people context to, and even links to the information to try to help make those decisions if necessary. So again, these links are here for you to be able to utilize to try to understand if you need to make any decisions there in your environment. And oftentimes it's good to just understand how threat actors are using these vulnerabilities so you can adjust your layers of defense within your organization. In this case, there's a social element. Is the type of attack they're doing something that you're using as an example within your phishing training within your organization? A lot of times, our own security team here at Ivanti will, if they've blocked a campaign that was trying to target us, they'll oftentimes look at that campaign and see how it differs from other training we've done, and even replicate that campaign to do for internal phishing training. So things like that can help you adapt and adjust your approach to securing your environment beyond just do I need to make a decision about when and how soon I might patch. So some good information in this article that kind of talks about the particular tactics of this threat actor in there. Another one, the second article here, has some additional leveraging points from both CISA and Microsoft, kind of talking about the vulnerability as well, maybe able to give you more references if you need to, push on stakeholders to say we might need to do something sooner. Oftentimes it helps to have that additional third-party perspective in there. So I included those two links, which cover the vulnerability that's being targeted right now, the high-level details of it, and also some backing recommendations from vendors and practitioners. The third article that I wanted to show today is there was a recent Google Chrome 0 day that was resolved. And this is actually the second one since May Patch Tuesday that Google has resolved. And in this case, the CVE 2025-5419 was a vulnerability in the V8 JavaScript engine. There is exploits in the wild. They didn't have further details on who or how broadly this was being executed, but they did seem to kind of stealthily get this update out there and then announce that the version was available shortly after. So in this case, it seems like something that they definitely tried to rush out and make sure that they had a fix in market, and then started to announce that it was available there. It allowed an attacker to remotely attack a potentially, basically taking advantage of a heap corruption vulnerability in the browser, to allow them to craft a HTML page to execute arbitrary code. So kind of one of the nastier ways that you can take advantage of browser vulnerabilities. They were able to execute code by just convincing a user to go to an HTML page. So the bar there is pretty low as far as convincing users to go somewhere. If I cast a wide enough net, statistically, I will get somebody to click on it. So that type of campaign makes it very easy for threat actors to take advantage of it. So that's the most recent zero-day vulnerability on Google Chrome. One thing that I wanted to show is because of the steady stream of releases, I thought it was a interesting time to look at and possibly even question how frequently you're doing certain updates. So this timeline, I've jumped back over into the slides there. This shows a timeline of the three major browsers over the past 5 weeks and how many CVEs they've been resolving. And in cases where there were 0 days, also calling out and linking to some news articles in some of those cases as well. So if you go back to the week of May 12th, this was Patch Tuesday in May. Shortly after Patch Tuesday, basically later in that week, our Google had responded to a 0-day vulnerability. So that's the CVE 2025-4664. So they resolved that 0-day vulnerability along with one other CVE. And that meant that Edge needed to update as well because Edge is Chromium based. So we had two browsers with a 0-day vulnerability being resolved in that week of May 12th. The week of May 19th. So this is the Pwn2Own Berlin wrapped up the previous week into the weekend, and Mozilla had released their Firefox update to resolve the CVEs that were showcased as part of the Pwn2Own conference. There were two vulnerabilities that were shown there. Now, the risk when you have a live event like that is that's basically counted as a disclosure at that point. So a threat actor, if they got enough details about how the researcher was trying to exploit that vulnerability, they may be able to piece together where to try to look to take advantage of it. So Mozilla and basically all of the browser vendors watch events like that and try to respond to the vulnerabilities found in those very quickly because it's high profile and could be jumped on very quickly. Chrome happened to fix 5 more CVEs that week as well. And then we go into the following week, the week of May 12th, or I'm sorry, the week of May 26th, Firefox resolves 10 more CVEs. Chrome fixes 5 more CVEs, and Edge catches up with basically 2 weeks worth of updates. So they resolve 12 CVEs in their release there. And then we get into the week of June 2nd, where we have the second Chrome 0-day in a month. And that one got resolved along with Edge having to resolve the 0-day as well. So both Chrome and Edge had a 0-day that needed to be resolved that week. And we lead into the week of June 9th. So yesterday, Chrome and Firefox both had additional releases with 2 more CVEs each. So what you're seeing here, this can be any given month. Chrome has basically gone to a weekly cadence of resolving security vulnerabilities. So basically, we've been seeing a security update from Chrome, which means a security update from Edge pretty much every week. Edge occasionally does a roll-up where they'll take 2 weeks worth and roll it up into one release on their side. But there's this accumulation of vulnerabilities that's consistently happening and leaves you exposed for periods of time here. If you wait from one Patch Tuesday to the other, that's a very long period of time to let some of these vulnerabilities stick around out there. You may be relying on things like auto updaters for some of these browsers, but that doesn't guarantee you that those are being updated consistently. You want this as part of your patch management solutions update process as well, to ensure that those browsers are getting up to date and users aren't just ignoring the auto update feature. So this is a very important consideration that each of you need to make for your organization. One of the things that any of you who are using the Neurons patch experience, you'll see that we've already created a way for customers to adapt to this kind of continuous release model. So the default Windows patch policy comes with your regular maintenance, which is typically going to start with Patch Tuesday and run, for whatever your release cycle is, whether it's 14 days, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever it is. But that's your each month when you're going to do the OS update and whatever other updates are available at that time. we've got a priority updates track where it's considered to be more of a weekly or even a daily task, where you're consistently going out and resolving or updating releases from select vendors that you want to ensure are getting updated more consistently. The browser's probably your top priority in that bucket. But there may be some other applications, like the different platforms that we use to communicate within our organization or without our organization. So Zoom, Teams, other media platforms like that you need to ensure are kept up to date, because again, those are platforms that users are commonly using and have been targeted at times to basically find ways to socially engineer their way into a situation. So looking at many of those high priority apps that you want to update more consistently and doing those in that priority updates task is where a lot of our customers are shifting to. The other thing that priority task is good for is once you do complete your regular maintenance, you basically say, okay, all the patches from that, let's assign those now to that priority updates task as our baseline. So if a user happens to be out for some reason during the window where they were supposed to patch during regular maintenance. So let's say Todd was on vacation, for the patch window where he was supposed to get updated in May. When he comes back, we want to ensure that he gets patched. If we have that priority task as a baseline as well, where anybody who is out of compliance gets patched and is ensured that they're up to date. That way, if somebody else reverts a patch or they install something that happens to revert a vulnerability to be exposed again, those types of scenarios, those edge cases are consistently caught and brought back into alignment. For those of you who are using our Endpoint Manager product, this is what you've referred to over the years as autofix. That priority updates track acts as that autofix, basically bringing everything into compliance once we deem that it's part of our baseline. So that's being used in a couple of different ways to make sure that we've got more consistent tasks to be able to make sure that things are kept up to date. The zero-day response task, that third task, is when if we make that decision to say, hey, I need this Chrome update out sooner, I'm in an area or I'm of a profile that this threat actor typically targets, I can take that vulnerability and basically add it to my patch group for that zero-day response task, and I can have that task executing daily. Majority of the time, it's never going to see anything to update. But when it does see one of those zero-day vulnerabilities that it needs to update, we want it to be able to catch that, and we want it to catch it quickly, because organizations that have defined a zero-day response policy, the average time frame for resolution for those, once they decide to resolve that vulnerability, is typically within 48 hours. So you want a consistent, fast means to be able to do that. Now, the way this differs from traditional kind of out-of-day response tasks, in an out-of-band response, you're basically saying, okay, stop everything. We need to go and identify what patch needs to be deployed, and we need to go find, configure it to be rolled out. Zero-day response is a different way of looking at that. We've already pre-agreed that we've got a process in place. If we decide to pull the trigger on a patch, we know exactly what needs to be done by who and when it will start to execute. If the task is already configured in my configuration, it's just waiting for us to basically decide that there's a new vulnerability we want to add to that policy. Once we trigger that, it's a simple matter of a minute that it takes to say, here's the CVE, import that into this particular policy task, and it knows exactly which patches it applies to. Let's say that vulnerability applies to both Chrome and Edge. It will, in that single CVE, it would be able to identify both of those patches and make sure both patches get added to that policy and ensure that it gets rolled out to all the devices that are affected by one, the other, or both. So that type of zero-day response also layers in here to give you that regular, routine kind of operating mode, that continuous priority mode, and making sure that we stay compliant, and that zero-day response mode all within a single configuration. So this is, as you start to think about evolving to more of a exposure management mindset, this is what we refer to as defining your risk appetite. I know exactly what needs to be done in what time frames, and I also know the process of when to go into that zero-day response mode. The system is already configured to execute these things, and off we go. But this just gives you a really good example of why it's necessary to consider making changes within your organization on how you're responding to these things. Now, this may not apply to all machines consistently. You may do this for your end user systems and your server systems. They may need to stick with certain maintenance windows. But if you've de-risked the end user side, both of the 0 days we talked about here are user targeted. So if I've mitigated the risk on the end user side, the server side is safe from those. Even if the Edge browser is on those devices, I don't have to worry about that because there's not a user sitting on there getting phished and convinced to go click on an HTML link. That's happening on their endpoint. So this model also lets you do things where you're operating in mitigation of the risks in the areas where you need it most and staying within maintenance boundaries for the areas where you're operationally not able to bring things offline as frequently. But just a couple of things to consider there and putting it in a visual so you can take that example back to stakeholders and say, here's why we need to approach this differently. All right, that was my one harping, topic for the day. We're going to go into the rest of the articles for what we've got. The first one here, the known exploited vulnerability in WebDAV. This is the 0 day this month. Rated important by Microsoft, 8.8 CVSS score. So right at the tipping point of getting up into that critical range. But still, for a lot of organizations, rated as important. A lot of times you may miss this in your prioritization. So a risk adjusted score of this would push it up into that 9x range and put it at a severity of critical because it's been actively exploited. The details on this one, this is one of those vulnerabilities that happens to be in the Edge HTML and scripting engine in the browser. So those of you who are still running some of the older platforms, Server 2012 R2, 2012, in extreme cases, maybe 2008 if you're still running that, if you're on the ESU for that still. Microsoft doesn't really officially advertise that one, but they still have the patch released for it. In those cases, if you're doing the security only update, you do need to make sure to do the OS update and the IE cumulative update for those platforms, because the IE piece has several other components that are exposed in there that need to be updated as well. So both updates are required if you're on the older platforms and doing the security only approach. If you're on Windows 10 and later and doing the cumulative model, then it's just push the OS update and it's all included. The next vulnerability is a public disclosure. This one is in the Windows SMB client. Now, Windows SMB, any of you who remember some of the nasty wormable vulnerabilities that we've had over the years, this is one where there is a risk of threat actors being able to take advantage of this to execute across your network in a much more pervasive way. It's elevation of privilege vulnerability. It could allow them to gain system level privileges, and it is allowed to execute across the network. So that's the attack vector is network level for those of you familiar with the metrics in CVSS scoring. On the temporal side, the code maturity for this is proof of concept level. So the fact that this is publicly disclosed, there could be code samples enough for somebody to take advantage of this much more quickly, and it's in the SMB protocol. That makes this one an ideal target and bumps the priority up on this one again into that critical range from a risk-adjusted scoring perspective. The good news is both of these are in the OS update for this month. So getting that OS update in place is going to resolve both the 0 day and the publicly disclosed vulnerability. It does affect all of the Windows OS editions from 2008 all the way up through Server 2025 and Windows 11 24H2. So that is the lineup on the Microsoft side. We did have one Ivanti update this month, 3 CVEs resolved, no disclosures or exploits in there, just 3 high CVEs that were resolved in there. So those of you running Ivanti Workspace Control, you can click on the link in this one, and that will take you to the advisory page, which will also get you to all of the information you need on versions affected, and download links, things like that. So you can grab that update if you're on that product. Switching gears into the Linux side, we have a partnership with a vendor called TuxCare. TuxCare is solely focused on the Linux side, and they take a very specific approach called live patching to the Linux platforms. So those of you who may be a little bit more familiar with Linux, live patching is something that Oracle introduced for a couple of their specific platforms, but TuxCare has brought into a broader reach within more flavors of Linux. So they have a very broad set of platforms they cover, and they can do this live patching approach, which makes it so that they can patch things like the kernel on a Linux system without having to reboot. So that makes it so you can prolong any large disruption to your production Linux systems for longer periods of time and just do that reboot level maintenance once in a while with your full patch process. The live patching approach just patches in memory, so it's not changing out the files on disk, so that once in a while you do want to still have that full patch window with reboot and make sure everything on disk gets updated as well. But it's a very effective approach for especially the Linux web services and other things like that, where you want to minimize that downtime for as much as possible. They have shared 3 vulnerabilities with us this month that are worth taking a look at. The first one is a kernel vulnerability. 7.8 CVSS score affects any distros using the kernel 5.15 and less. So pretty much all the Linux flavors out there. Many of the Linux platforms have already made this update available. So getting up to your later kernel versions on whatever flavors you're supporting today should resolve most of them. For Debian systems, there's fixed versions that are available in Bookworm, and you can see the details there on the mitigation side that provide you the versions that you'll want to know about there. Most of the others I saw, Ubuntu, Oracle, several of the others, the latest kernel updates will resolve this one. The next one is an interesting one. If you Google this CVE, you're going to see a blog post from a researcher who found this, and they happened to find this with AI. So it was an interesting researcher experiment here. The CVSS on this was very low, but really what's more interesting about this is the way that they found it. So they were able to, using OpenAI's O3 model, they were able to look at and find this zero-day vulnerability in the Linux kernel. So an interesting experiment to look at how they were using AI to help in facilitating vulnerability research. Now, obviously, this can be used as much for evil as for good. A threat researcher uses this to find something and report it and help get it fixed. A threat actor could use it to find something and take advantage of it. So, but definitely an interesting one to look at if you want to read the blogger, his whole write-up on how he approached finding it. So the third one is another Linux kernel vulnerability. This one, again, a higher CVSS score, but still not quite in that critical range. So it's a high, not a critical, but it affects several different Linux versions there, all Linux kernels up to 6.0.7. Many of the Linux platforms have, gotten to this version of the Linux kernel now as well. So I saw links for several of them. One of the challenges with the Linux side, the open source nature makes it so that each of these vulnerabilities, it's up to each of the different flavors to integrate on their side. So you may have to look and see, do the Linux flavors that you're supporting do that? Majority of the mainstream ones do support the Linux kernel that resolves each of the vulnerabilities we talked about here today already, but you may have some distros that may not, or your specific distro, if you're using something custom, if that branch has not gotten up to the latest kernel, that could be a limitation. But for the most part, latest kernel will resolve all 3 of the vulnerabilities we talked about today. There were some developer tools updating this month. So Windows SDK, Visual Studio, .NET Framework. So if you've got developers in-house that are using any of those tools, there are some updates available for those. And on the end of life side, we are getting month by month here, one step closer to Windows 10 end of life. So be aware. I know many of you are probably still working through the migration to Windows 11. There's a mad dash for many organizations to do that. But if you are needing that ESU support, again, Ivanti does have the ability to complement that. And whether you're using our Neurons patch solution in the cloud, or if you're using our on-prem EPM or security controls products, we can provide a ESU support feed for that as well. So you would still have to subscribe to Microsoft to get the ESU support because they have to actually give you a license or enable the Azure Arc agent to be able to authorize the use of those ESU updates. But then you can subscribe to our feed to get that content to continue using our products to patch it. So that is available if you need it. Reach out to your account rep. On that note, Todd, I think we are ready to switch over to you for the bulletins and releases.
Sounds good.
Go ahead.
Okay, let's talk about what was released yesterday. Chris did talk about the update for Chrome. Obviously, that came out with 2 vulnerabilities. One thing that's interesting to note, Chris also talked about the Pwn2Own and all the different ways that bugs are identified. Google is kind of interesting in that they actually do put the amount they paid for the vulnerabilities. I don't know if you've seen that on their latest pages if you subscribe to their security bulletin updates. But that first vulnerability there, 5958, they paid $8,000 to somebody who found that particular one. So kind of interesting. Just kind of an interesting side note there on that one. Moving on, we did have an update for Acrobat and Reader this month. 10 vulnerabilities that were addressed. 4 of those were rated critical. 6 of those were rated important. Microsoft or Adobe is not aware of any exploits in the wild, so that's good to hear. We did see an update for Adobe InCopy. Again, this is part of the Creative Cloud suite. 2 vulnerabilities addressed there. Neither of these were known exploited either. And then finally, the last one here on the Creative Cloud side, we had an update for Adobe InDesign. 9 vulnerabilities in this one, though. 5 of those were rated critical, 4 of those important. So you definitely want to go through your Creative Cloud updates this month. Make sure you get those. We did see, it's kind of unusual, but we did see a Firefox update drop on Patch Tuesday. 2 vulnerabilities addressed there was rated high. Neither of these known exploited. These were denial of service type vulnerabilities within the browser itself. And we also saw an update for Thunderbird. I grouped these together here on the same page because they have the same CVE. Sounds pretty nasty if you read about it. Basically, anything that has 3 slashes in front of it that you download can actually, I put a question mark by remote code execution because I'm not quite sure where the vulnerability exists. But in the title of the vulnerability itself, it does say that when you click on something that has a triple slash in front of it, it can download and it can do a denial of service attack by flooding your system with downloads, or it can go as far as to stealing confidential information off your system. So definitely an important vulnerability. They only rated high, which I thought was interesting, but one you should be aware of if you're running the Thunderbird email program. So definitely be aware of that one, released yesterday as well. So getting finally into the Microsoft updates, we did have a critical update for Windows 11, the usual, of course, updates. Again, a very large file again this month, 3.6 gigabits roughly in size. This patch is very large, includes some of the AI updates that we talked about last month as well. They did fix 41 vulnerabilities. I did highlight the 2 here. The 33053 that Chris talked about is the known exploited WebDAV issue. And then the 33073 is the publicly disclosed vulnerability that he talked about as well. So be aware of those. There were some new issues reported this month. It has to do with the fonts. Microsoft basically carried over the fonts from Google with regards to the Chinese, Japanese, and Korean text. They have an issue when it's displayed under a low DPI setting where they're very blurry looking. They said as a temporary fix, they recommend that you upgrade your display scaling a little bit, 125 or 150 for text clarity. They are investigating the issue. It does also show up in the latest version, Windows 11 24H2 as well. So kind of be aware of that one for some of you that are running those particular characters on your screen. The Windows 10 update, similar in nature to the Windows 11, same sort of vulnerability set. 2 additional ones, 43 vulnerabilities in there. Same impact overall, though, with regards to all the way from remote code execution to information disclosure. And same 2 known, exploited, and publicly disclosed vulnerabilities again in this particular release. And interestingly enough, they also had the same problem with the font issue. Now, one thing I saw also in clicking through the releases yesterday, and I didn't note it here, is that for the 2019 versions, when I clicked on the KB articles for them, they're still linked to last month. I don't know if they've updated them, and I have a chance to look at that today. And they were still reporting that Citrix issue that they had, and it's the only particular KB that still had that listed. But be aware of that one. I'll take a look and see if they've updated that. You can take a look and see if they've resolved that this month. They had cleaned up that Citrix issue across Windows 11 and a lot of the Windows 10 updates. So hopefully that's resolved this month as well. But I didn't see an update on the KBs. I'll have to go back and take a look at that. As far as Office goes, we did have an update for the Office suite. As usual, 11 vulnerabilities addressed this month. There were some critical ones in there, which rated this. Usually you see an important on the Office side, but this month definitely rated critical. So any of you running the older versions of Office, the old 2016 versions on your local machines, make sure you get this update implemented. We did see, obviously, included the click-to-run versions as well, also rated critical. A few additional vulnerabilities, 14. These are all remote code execution vulnerabilities as well. So you definitely want to make sure that you do the Office updates this month. And as usual, there's sometimes we get some questions from some of our customers about where are the Office updates on Patch Tuesday? Well, generally, Microsoft releases those later in the afternoon, and we generally get around to the content production for those. So you'll see those coming out here shortly today on all the Office updates. SharePoint Server also had a critical update, 5 vulnerabilities addressed. I did list them here because there's a short number. None of these are known exploited or publicly disclosed. Microsoft did report a known issue with the subscription version where the May version wasn't properly updated, so they had a problem with the June version as well being updated. They said you have to get in touch with Microsoft support if you run into any issues there. They said this will be fixed in July, so we have another month to wait until they get this problem cleaned up. Of course, not everybody releases on Patch Tuesday, so I do put together a list of the applications that we supported between the Patch Tuesdays. We break them down into a couple of different categories. Security updates that include CVEs. I have a list of those on the top here. We'll go through those in a moment. We have a lot of application updates that come out that maybe the vendor does not necessarily say specifically what CVEs were addressed, but they will say these are security updates, so we will lump them into the second category. And finally, the bottom category there is if we don't know much about them, we will lump them into the non-security updates. These are generally performance enhancements, bug fixes, but they may not necessarily be security type issues. So getting into the actual updates, Chris went through the browsers in quite a bit of detail. These are the numbers that correspond in the CVEs for the particular releases. If you look at our identifiers on these, you can see when these were released, from the 21st, the 27th, the 2nd of June, etc. We did have a late release on Azul Zulu coming out, even though that was last quarter as far as the update goes, but we didn't see it publicly released for quite a while. So there is an update on the Java side there, so be aware of that one. Here are all the Firefox browsers updates. They include the regular versions, 138, 139, as well as the extended support versions. 128 I have on this page. We did see some updates for Node.js here as well. This is a Horizon client, Opera. These are all just like onesies and twosies vulnerabilities, but we are identifying them and calling them out here specifically, so make sure you get those updated as part of your patching routine. Some updates for Snagit, Wireshark. A lot of us use that tool. They updated both versions, 42 and 44. We also saw some Thunderbird updates that I talked about as well. The largest one here just recently on June 5th with 10 vulnerabilities. Again, these are all rolled up into the most current versions. These are cumulative updates. So you're covered as long as you keep up to pace with the current releases as Chris was talking about. We also include the Apple release information as to what came out between the Patch Tuesdays. So moving through this list, basically in the same kind of order, we did see a number of the Creative Cloud Suite updates that came out. One of the things that we're doing is we're slowly adding support for the Mac OS side on Creative Cloud into our content. So some of these may be a little bit older. So for example, Adobe InCopy here, one of the last ones that was released for Mac was 2510. We realize there's another update now, so we'll be including that in our updated releases. But again, these were released a little while ago. We did include the Adobe Media Encoder, InDesign, and Animate as well. Here are those Chrome releases Chris was talking about, again, coming from the Mac side. A lot of times these are obviously the same versions and same vulnerability numbers, but we include them here, so make sure that you're updating them regularly on your Mac systems as well. Again, the Firefox releases here, 10 vulnerabilities, spotted 7 vulnerabilities, etc. We did see Thunderbird releases as well. So basically tracking across both the Apple and the Mac and the Windows side as well. As far as running Edge, you can see that there have been a lot of recent updates for Edge running on top of Mac, very quick turnarounds on some of these. You'll see we have one released on June 2nd, another released on June 4th, and another released on June 6th. So a lot of revs on the Edge browser running on Mac. Definitely a challenge to keep up with. You want to make sure you're always updating quickly as possible within your environment to address any of these, which may potentially be 0 days at the time they come out. So as Chris said, we have that functionality built into our product set to update fairly quickly. So make sure you take advantage of that. as you're rolling out these updates across your environment. With that, Chris, that includes all the updates that came out yesterday, as well as a look between the Patch Tuesdays.